The handcuffs clicked shut in front of 200 people. Officer Mason Drake yanked Evelyn Brooks away from her own car, spun her against the hood, and pinned her there with one hand while he read the charges loud enough for the entire Silver Ridge Medical Center parking lot to hear. Theft of military medical supplies, possession of restricted equipment, obstruction. Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't fight. She turned her head just enough to look at him and said quietly, "Officer, you're making a mistake." Drake laughed. Actually laughed. Then he shoved her into the back of the cruiser. 12 minutes later, 4 armored military vehicles rolled through the hospital's main entrance. Every soldier inside was asking the same question. Where is Lieutenant Evelyn Brooks? If this story already has you hooked, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe and follow this channel so you don't miss a single moment. Hit like, drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from, and let me see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all started. Raven Falls, Montana was the kind of town that looked peaceful from the highway and felt suffocating the moment you stayed long enough to know people. The mountains were real. The sky was real. Most everything else had a second layer underneath it that took years to find. Evelyn Brooks had been in Raven Falls for 3 years, long enough to know the layout of Silver Ridge Medical Center without looking, long enough to know which vending machine on the second floor jammed if you picked anything in the D column, long enough to have stopped explaining herself to people who had already decided what she was. She was 31 years old. She drove a used Subaru with a cracked passenger side mirror she kept meaning to replace. She rented a 2-bedroom apartment on Caldwell Street and used the second bedroom as storage because she didn't own enough furniture to fill the first. She worked the overnight ER shift 3 days a week and picked up float shifts whenever the charge nurse called, which was often, because Evelyn almost always said yes. The staff at Silver Ridge knew her as competent and quiet. Not unfriendly exactly, but not the kind of person who lingered in the break room or brought cookies on birthdays. She did her work. She didn't complain. She showed up early and left late and never asked for recognition. Nobody knew much about her before Raven Falls, and she didn't offer. The morning it happened was a Thursday in late October, and Evelyn had just finished a 12-hour overnight. She was still in her scrubs, her ID badge clipped to her chest, her sneakers damp from a spill she'd dealt with around 4 in the morning. She had a travel mug of bad coffee going cold in her left hand and her car keys in her right, and she was walking across the employee parking lot with exactly one goal: get home and sleep before her phone started ringing again. She noticed the patrol car as she turned between the rows. It was idling near the back of the lot, which was unusual. Most officers who came to Silver Ridge parked up front near the ER entrance. She didn't think much of it. She had her head down, reading a text from her neighbor about a package delivery, when the door opened. "Hey!" The voice was sharp, authoritative in the way that had nothing behind it. "Nurse, stop walking." She stopped. She looked up. Officer Mason Drake was 29, built broad in the shoulders, and had the particular quality of someone who had been given just enough power to ruin a bad day for anyone within reach. He wore his uniform like it meant something beyond itself. His jaw was set at an angle that suggested he'd already made up his mind about whatever came next. Evelyn recognized him vaguely. She'd seen him in the ER twice before, once when he brought in a DUI, and once when he'd come in demanding records on someone she couldn't discuss, and both times he'd been the kind of difficult that took energy to manage. She'd managed it and moved on, and hadn't thought about him since. "Can I help you?" she asked. He was already moving toward her. Not walking, moving the way someone does when they want to make the distance feel like pressure. He stopped about 3 feet away and looked her over in a way that was meant to feel like an inspection. "You work ER?" he said. "Yes." "You been working tonight?" "I just finished a 12-hour shift. I'm heading home." He looked at her badge, then at her car, a few spots behind her, then back at her face, and something in his expression shifted from assessment to decision, and she felt that shift before she could name it. "I'm going to need you to step to the back of your vehicle," he said. "Why?" "I'm conducting an investigation. Step to the back of your vehicle." She didn't move immediately, not because she was challenging him. She'd dealt with enough institutional authority to know the cost-benefit calculation on that was almost never worth it, but because she was tired and she needed a half-second to process what was happening. That half-second, it turned out, was all he needed. "Now," he said, louder, and his hand went to the back of her upper arm, and he steered her toward the Subaru with the kind of grip that wasn't quite painful, but was designed to leave no room for doubt about who was making decisions. There were other people in the parking lot. She saw them in her peripheral vision. A couple of nurses from the night shift walking out together. A radiology tech she knew by face but not name. A cafeteria worker on a break near the side entrance. They all stopped. Drake turned her to face the back of her car and kept one hand between her shoulder blades. I have a report that hospital medical supplies have been removed from the facility over the past several weeks. Specifically, military-grade trauma kits, certain controlled medication protocols, and equipment classified under a Federal Medical Reserve designation. Evelyn held very still. I don't know what you're talking about. A source placed you at the supply access point on 2 separate nights outside your documented shift hours. That's not accurate. Are you saying my source is lying? I'm saying whatever you were told is not accurate. I have never removed anything from this hospital that wasn't mine to take. Drake was quiet for a moment. He was enjoying this, she realized. Not in a sadistic way. He wasn't that complicated. He was enjoying it the way people enjoy being right when they've already decided they're right before the conversation began. Open your trunk, he said. She did. There were 3 things in her trunk. A first aid kit she'd bought herself. A reusable grocery bag with 2 items in it she hadn't taken in yet, and a flat of water bottles from a wholesale run 2 weeks ago. Drake looked at it. Then he reached in and pulled out the first aid kit. It was a good one. Military spec, the kind she'd bought off a surplus site 3 years ago because she knew what was in them and she trusted the quality. It had a tourniquet, hemostatic gauze, a chest seal, a decompression needle, a foil emergency blanket, and a set of trauma shears. Drake held it up. This kit, he said, matches the description of restricted equipment reported missing from Silver Ridge's military liaison supply room. It doesn't belong to the hospital, Evelyn said. I bought that myself. It's personal property. Can you prove that? She hesitated. I can give you the purchase record. I'd have to find it. So right now you cannot prove this doesn't belong to Silver Ridge Medical Center. She looked at him. She kept her voice level. Officer, that kit has been in my trunk for 3 years. I bought it online. I can show you the order. Right now, he said, you cannot prove it. She understood what was happening. Not a misunderstanding, a choice. Officer, she said, one more time, and her voice was quieter now, the way it got when things got serious, when the situation around her was deteriorating faster than anyone else in the room had noticed yet. You're making a mistake. He smiled, not a kind smile, a smile that said he'd heard that before and found it tedious. Turn around, he said. He cuffed her in front of all of them. She heard someone gasp. She heard someone say her name, Renata Voss, one of the night shift nurses, who she could see in her peripheral vision with her hand over her mouth. She heard the sound of the parking lot, the way you hear things when your wrists are locked behind you, and the morning air is cold and everything is slightly unreal. Drake walked her to the cruiser. He put his hand on top of her head in the practiced way, not roughly, just mechanically, the way someone guides livestock. She ducked into the back seat without being told. The door shut. Through the window, she could see the small cluster of people who'd stopped to watch. Renata was on her phone already. The radiology tech was saying something to the cafeteria worker. Nobody intervened. They didn't know what they were watching yet. Drake got in the front and pulled out of the lot. Evelyn looked at the back of his headrest. She breathed in through her nose, held it, let it out. Her wrists were uncomfortable but not painful. The seat smelled like fast food and synthetic upholstery cleaner. She had been in worse places than this. Much worse. She thought about what would happen next, and she was calm about it in a way that might have worried someone who knew her better than anyone in this town did. The station was a 20-minute drive, and Drake spent most of it on his radio. She gathered from the fragments she caught that he had already filed the report before he approached her, which meant this wasn't improvised. Someone had given him something, and he'd moved on it, and the fact that the thing he'd been given was wrong wasn't going to become apparent to him for a while yet. At the station, she was processed with the efficient impersonality of a place that did this every day. Fingerprints. Photo. Personal effects bagged. They let her make a call, and she called the hospital's HR line and left a message that was brief and factual. She had been arrested in the parking lot. She was at the Raven Falls PD. She had not done what she was being accused of. Then she sat in a holding room and waited. Drake came in after about 40 minutes. He set a folder on the table, which was theater, because there wasn't much in it. He told her that the supply room inventory discrepancy had been reported 3 days ago by the Silver Ridge facilities manager, a man named Gary Plum, who Evelyn recognized as someone who had never spoken directly to her in 3 years, but who apparently had opinions about her schedule. Drake told her that 2 nurses had allegedly seen her badge access the supply room outside her authorized hours. "Which nurses?" she asked. "I'm not at liberty to say. I have a right to know who's accusing me." "You have the right to an attorney. I'd focus on that." She looked at him. He was different here than he'd been in the parking lot. Slightly less electric with the performance of authority, slightly more settled in the bureaucratic part of this. He leaned back in his chair in a way that suggested he considered this situation concluded, pending paperwork. "Mr. Drake," she said. "Officer Drake. I've worked at Silver Ridge for 3 years. I've had a clean record. I've never been disciplined, never had a complaint filed. The kit in my trunk is personal property I can document. The access logs you're referencing are almost certainly going to show you exactly when and why I was in that corridor, and it's going to match a patient transfer I was part of in September. Whatever your source told you, they were either wrong or they lied." He watched her while she spoke. He didn't take notes. "That's what lawyers are for," he said. She sat back. She stopped talking. She was thinking about the route home from the station, which she'd have to figure out without a car. She was thinking about her phone, which was in the evidence bag, and the shift she was supposed to pick up Friday, and whether Renata had gotten through to anyone who mattered at the hospital. She was not thinking about anything that had happened before Raven Falls, because she had gotten very good at keeping that in a separate room. But it was there. It had always been there, and whatever Drake thought he was managing in that holding room, he had no idea what he'd actually put into motion. Back at Silver Ridge, the story spread the way things spread in a hospital, fast, fragmented, and emotionally amplified by exhaustion and proximity. By 7 in the morning, the overnight shift had told the day shift, and the day shift had told the charge nurses. And the charge nurses were in a complicated position because on one hand, Evelyn was a valued staff member, and on the other hand, she had been arrested for theft, and institutions protect themselves first. Dr. Marcus Fail, the chief of emergency medicine, heard about it at 7:15 while he was eating a granola bar and answering emails in his office. He set down the granola bar and reread the message from the nursing director twice. Fail was 54, had been at Silver Ridge for 11 years, and operated with the combination of competence and cautious self-interest that most department chiefs eventually settled into. He did not dislike Evelyn. She was one of his better nurses. But better nurse and nurse arrested on federal adjacent supply theft charges were two facts that did not coexist comfortably, and his first call was to the hospital's legal team. His second call was to the facilities manager, Gary Plum, who answered on the first ring with the aggressive enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting by the phone. "I filed the report 3 days ago," Plum said. "I flagged the discrepancy. I followed protocol." "You named a specific nurse?" "I gave the officer a list of possible access points." He identified the individual. Fail rubbed his eyes. "Gary, do you have any direct evidence linking Evelyn Brooks to the missing supplies?" "The access logs show her badge in that corridor." "Her badge or her?" A pause. "The badge." Fail was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to need the full report on my desk by 9. Don't talk to anyone else about this until I've read it." He hung up and stood at his window for a moment, looking out at the parking lot. He could see the spot where, by all accounts, Drake had cuffed her. There was still a small cluster of day shift staff standing near the entrance, talking in the way people talk when something has happened that everyone has opinions about and nobody has facts. He felt something uncomfortable in his chest. Not guilt, exactly. More like the early warning of something he hadn't accounted for. The first military vehicle came through the main entrance at 8:47 in the morning. The security guard at the front desk, a retired county deputy named Harv Odom, saw it on the camera feed and sat forward slowly, the way people do when they're not sure they're seeing what they think they're seeing. Then the second one came through. Then the third. By the time Harv was on the phone with the administrator on duty, there were 4 of them, and they were pulling up in a configuration that was not the configuration of vehicles that were lost or visiting or making a routine delivery. They stopped with the deliberate geometry of people who had coordinated this in advance. Dr. Fail heard about it at 8:51. He was in the middle of a sentence with the nursing director, and he stopped in the middle of it and went to the window. The vehicle doors opened. Soldiers in combat utilities stepped out, not in a hostile way, not with weapons drawn or any theater of aggression, but with the quiet efficiency of people who had specific objectives and were moving toward them. Their uniforms carried insignia that Phil recognized in the abstract way civilians recognize things they've seen in movies and on the news without fully understanding rank structures or unit designations. Leading them was a man who was clearly in command, not because of the insignia on his collar, which Phil couldn't read from the window, but because of the way the others oriented to him. He walked through the hospital's main entrance like the building already belonged to the mission. Phil met him in the lobby. The man's name, he would learn shortly, was Colonel Devin Marsh, and he had the focused economy of someone who did not make visits. He made arrivals. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge of this facility," Marsh said, not unkindly, but without any preliminary. "I'm Dr. Marcus Fail, Chief of Emergency Medicine." "Where's Nurse Evelyn Brooks?" The question landed in the lobby the way questions land when they carry weight that the people in the room don't yet understand. Phil felt every administrator and front desk staff member within earshot go very still. He stopped. "She's not currently on the premises." "Where is she?" Phil looked at the soldiers behind Marsh, at the vehicles visible through the glass doors, at the clean and absolute seriousness of the man in front of him, and felt the full weight of what he had not yet asked Gary Plum to explain. "She was arrested this morning," he said. "Raven Falls PD." Marsh's expression did not change. He turned to one of the soldiers behind him, a woman with a tablet, and said two words that Phil didn't catch. Then he turned back. "Get her released," he said. "Now." "I don't have that authority." "I do," Marsh said. "I need her here in the next 40 minutes. What I'm about to tell you will explain why." He pulled Phil slightly aside, and what he said next, quietly, in the middle of the Silver Ridge lobby, with soldiers standing behind him and the parking lot full of armored vehicles, made Phil's granola bar sit very badly in his stomach. The highway was Route 12, about 11 miles east of Raven Falls, and the explosion had happened at 8:22 that morning, which was while Evelyn was sitting in the holding room and Drake was finishing his paperwork, feeling good about his morning. A fuel tanker, a malfunction, and a convoy of transport vehicles carrying personnel from a military logistics exercise in the mountains. The details would come out slowly over the following hours, but what mattered at 8:47, when the first casualties started arriving at Silver Ridge, was the volume and severity. 7 critical, 11 serious, 4 with blast injuries that required immediate surgical intervention, and 2 with internal trauma that was already beginning to kill them. The Silver Ridge trauma team was good. They weren't unprepared. But they weren't trained for this. Not for blast injuries with this specific pattern, not for the overlap of closed head trauma and internal hemorrhage, and airway compromise that combat medicine had developed its own protocols for because conventional hospital training hadn't caught up. Dr. Lena Kiao, the senior trauma surgeon on duty, was already calling for backup she didn't have yet. She was managing as many simultaneous critical cases as her team could physically handle, and she knew, with the particular clarity of a surgeon who has reached the edge of what she can do, that 2 of the patients in front of her were going to die unless someone in that building knew exactly what to do. Colonel Marsh walked into the trauma bay at 9:04. He looked at the scene. He looked at Chiao. He looked at the monitors and the patients and the staff moving between them with controlled urgency. "She's not here yet," Chiao said. She didn't ask who he was or why he was there. She'd been briefed in 2 minutes by Phil. "Drake's releasing her now." Marsh nodded. He looked at the patient in Bay 3, a young soldier, maybe 22, with a blast wound to the left chest and a pressure reading that was trending in one direction only. "How long?" he said. 10 minutes, maybe 12. He looked at the soldier, then he looked at the doors. "She'll make it," he said, and it wasn't optimism. It was a statement about Evelyn Brooks specifically, about what he knew of her, about the version of this moment he had seen her navigate before, in places that made a Montana hospital trauma bay look like a controlled experiment. The doors opened 11 minutes later. Evelyn walked in, still wearing her scrubs from the overnight, her wrists faintly red where the cuffs had been, her travel mug of cold coffee gone, her face carrying the specific alertness of someone who had been waiting for the situation to catch up to itself. She looked at the trauma bay. She looked at the patients. She looked at Marsh. "Talk to me," she said, and she was already moving toward Bay 3, already reading the monitor, already processing the information spread across the room in the practiced way of someone who had walked into worse than this and knew exactly where to start. Marsh started briefing her as she moved. She was already putting on gloves. Dr. Chiao was beside her, handing her the chart. Everyone else in the trauma bay, the nurses, the residents, the attending physicians who had watched her be arrested in the parking lot 2 hours ago, stood exactly where they were and watched Evelyn Brooks take the room. Officer Mason Drake was still in the parking lot, sitting in his cruiser with the engine running, watching the armored vehicles he had pulled in around his car, trying to understand what had just happened to his very good morning. His radio crackled. Dispatch. A voice he didn't recognize, clipped and official. "Drake, report to the station. Captain Holloway wants you in his office." He picked up the handset slowly. Through the windshield, he could see soldiers moving in and out of the hospital entrance with the coordinated purpose of people who had somewhere to be and the authority to be there. A sergeant stopped near the doors and looked at Drake's cruiser for a long moment, not aggressive, just noting, before turning back inside. Drake set the handset down without responding. He didn't move yet. He was still trying to work out how a straightforward arrest of a night shift nurse had turned into 4 military vehicles in the hospital parking lot and its captain's voice on the radio 2 hours into a Thursday morning. He didn't have an answer, but the shape of it was beginning, faintly, to form in the back of his mind, and it felt the way things feel when you are standing at the edge of something that you cannot walk back from. Inside the trauma bay, Evelyn's voice was steady and clear over the sound of monitors and the controlled movement of a team that had just found its footing. "Bay 3 needs a chest decompression now. Someone get me a 14 gauge. Shall stay with me on the hemorrhage in Bay 1. I need the pressure up before we move her. Who's managing airway on the soldier in Bay 5? A resident raised his hand. "Good. Don't let go of that. If his sats drop below 92, you call me immediately. Don't wait." She moved through the room with an economy of motion that was different from confidence. Confidence was something you performed. This was something else. This was someone who had made decisions like these in conditions that made everyone in the room feel, faintly, and without being able to explain why, like they were watching a person doing what they were made for. The soldier in Bay 3, 22 years old, from a town in Oklahoma. His mother did not yet know he had left that morning, took his next breath without a machine. The soldier in Bay 3 took his next breath without a machine, and the resident standing at the foot of the bed let out a breath of his own that he hadn't known he was holding. Evelyn didn't pause. She stripped off the first pair of gloves, took a fresh pair from the box on the wall without looking at it, and moved to Bay 1, where Dr. Lena Chiao was managing a hemorrhage in a female soldier whose blood pressure had been sliding for the past 9 minutes in the wrong direction. "What's her belly look like?" Evelyn asked. "Rigid. Fast showed free fluid. She needs the OR now, not in 5 minutes. Is Hartman available?" "He's in 2. Pull him. This one can't wait." Hal looked at her for half a second. Not challenging, just recalibrating. And then she was on the phone. Evelyn was already at the bedside, her fingers on the soldier's wrist, reading the pulse manually the way some people read a room. The soldier was awake, barely, her eyes tracking with the glassy effort of someone using everything left to stay present. "Hey," Evelyn said. Not loudly, just close enough to register. "We've got you. You're going to the OR in 2 minutes. You're going to be okay." The soldier blinked. Her lips moved. Evelyn didn't ask her to repeat it. She just nodded once and moved aside for the transport team. The trauma bay had found a rhythm now, which was different from calm. Calm was an absence of urgency, and there was plenty of urgency. But the frantic, searching quality from 40 minutes ago, when the team had been managing too many critical patients without a clear command structure, had settled into something functional. People knew what the next step was. There was a voice in the room that had given each person a lane. That voice was Evelyn's, and it hadn't raised itself once. Colonel Marsh stood at the far edge of the bay, watching. He had deployed with enough trauma teams in enough places to know what he was looking at. He wasn't watching in surprise. He was watching in the particular way of someone whose assessment had been confirmed. The resident from Bay 3 appeared at Evelyn's elbow. His name badge said Pollard. He was maybe 26, looked tired in the honest way of someone who had been in the hospital since the previous afternoon. "Nurse Brooks," he said. "Bay 5. His sats just hit 91. She was already turning. I told you not to wait. I know. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Move. She was past him as she said it, not unkindly, just efficient. He followed. The soldier in Bay 5 was fighting the airway in the way patients fight when they're scared and their body is doing things they don't understand. Evelyn put her hand on his shoulder, firm, and leaned into his line of sight. Look at me, she said. Right here. I need you to stop fighting it and let me help you breathe. Can you do that? He was trying. His eyes were wild. Your name, she said. What's your name? His lips moved around the airway. Okay, I've got your ID. I know your name. I'm Evelyn. I'm going to fix this. She adjusted the airway position, checked the seal, recalibrated the ventilator setting with the kind of specific adjustment that came from knowing exactly what a blast-affected airway did at this stage. Not from a textbook, from having watched it happen, and made that adjustment before, in conditions where the difference between right and slightly wrong was measured in minutes. The sat climbed, 92, 94, 96. Pollard exhaled. Watch the trend, not the number, Evelyn said to him before walking away. If it drops again, it'll drop fast. She crossed to the medication station and found the nurse there, a day shift RN named Kobe, who had started this morning expecting a routine Thursday and who had spent the last hour looking at Evelyn Brooks with an expression that moved between professional focus and something harder to categorize. Kobe had been in the parking lot when Drake arrested her. She had not said anything. She had stood there with the others and watched, and she had not said anything, and now she handed Evelyn the chart she needed without making eye contact. I need the protocol for secondary blast pressure management, Evelyn said. The standard vasopressor ladder isn't going to work on the patient in 3. His system's already compensated once. We don't have that protocol in our system, Kobe said. Evelyn looked at her. I know. Write this down, she dictated. Kobe wrote. At some point during the second line, she looked up and met Evelyn's eyes, and whatever she'd been avoiding looking at directly, she stopped avoiding it. Got it, Kobe said. Good. Run it by Shao before you administer. She'll confirm. Doctor. Shao, walking past with a chart, said confirmed without stopping, which meant she'd heard the whole thing and processed it simultaneously, which was the kind of functional telepathy that good trauma teams developed after enough shared time in exactly this kind of situation. The bay continued. Someone brought Evelyn a bottle of water that she set down and forgot. A soldier was cleared and moved to the ICU. Another arrived from the ER entrance. A late transport, a man in his 40s with a closed head injury and a laceration along his jaw that was superficial but dramatic. Evelyn triaged him in 30 seconds. Serious but stable, treat and monitor. She handed him off and moved back to the center of the room. By 10:15, the immediate critical load had broken. 2 patients were in surgery. 3 were stabilized and moving to monitored beds. The soldier in Bay 3 was conscious and asking for water. The one in Bay 5 had sats in the high 90s and was being evaluated for extubation. Evelyn stood at the nurse's station and looked at the board. Her hands were steady. Her face looked like someone who hadn't slept in 17 hours, which was accurate, and who had also spent 2 of those hours in police custody, which was also accurate, but neither of those things was visible in the way she stood. What was visible was the specific quality of someone who had come down from something and knew, with the body knowledge of experience, that there would be a moment to process it later, and this was not that moment. Dr. Fiel appeared at her shoulder. He had been in the bay for most of the last hour, managing the administrative side of the surge, coordinating with the OR, fielding calls from the hospital administrator, handling the paperwork cascade that followed any mass casualty event. He had watched her work from various distances. He had not spoken to her directly since before the arrest. Do you need anything? He said. She glanced at him. The question hung there between them with all of its unasked parts. A new badge reader code, she said. Mine got flagged in whatever report started this morning. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, in the way someone is quiet when they are working out what to say about something they haven't fully understood yet. We should talk, he said, when things settle. We will, she said, and went back to the board. Mason Drake did not go to the station. He drove there, or he started to drive there, but halfway across town he pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat with the engine idling and tried to think clearly. The radio had crackled twice more with versions of the same message. Captain Holloway. His office. Now. He'd responded the second time with a clipped en route, and then not moved. He was trying to reconstruct the morning and having trouble making the pieces fit. He'd had a solid tip. Gary Plum, the Silver Ridge facilities manager, had called his personal cell 4 days ago and told him about the supply discrepancy, and mentioned Brooks specifically, not as a confirmed suspect, but as the person whose badge access corresponded most closely to the access window in question. Drake had run the name, found nothing notable, and decided the right move was to move on it before someone else did, or the trail went cold. He hadn't run a deeper background check because there hadn't seemed to be a reason to. A night shift nurse with 3 years at a regional hospital in Montana. What was there to run? He thought about the soldiers, the vehicles. The colonel who had walked into Silver Ridge like the building was already his. He thought about the way Brooks had looked when she walked into the trauma bay, still in the scrubs she'd been arrested in, wrists showing the marks of the cuffs, and completely, absolutely composed. Like someone walking back into a room they'd been temporarily asked to leave. He didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but he was beginning to, and the beginning of it felt bad. He picked up his phone. He typed her name into the search engine. Evelyn Brooks. Raven Falls. Silver Ridge Medical. Nothing useful. 3 years of digital silence, which he now understood was not the same thing as having nothing to hide. Sometimes it was the opposite. Sometimes people who'd been somewhere else entirely left that somewhere else entirely behind them when they moved. He typed, Evelyn Brooks, military. The results that came back were mostly locked or classified in the partial, frustrating way of government databases that showed you the outline of something and not the thing itself. But there was enough of an outline. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat. He thought about Gary Plum, who had called his personal cell and not the department's general line, who had named Brooks specifically, who had been on the phone when Drake called to tell him the arrest had been made and had been, Drake now remembered, in an unusual hurry to get off. Drake put the car in drive. He did not go to the station. He went back to Silver Ridge. The hospital's administrative floor was one level above the lobby, accessible by elevator or a stairwell that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. Gary Plum's office was at the end of the east corridor, past the supply chain manager and the billing director, behind a door that had his name on it in stick-on letters, the kind you got at an office supply store. Drake didn't knock particularly gently. Plum was at his desk, on the phone, and he looked up when the door opened with the expression of a man whose morning had also not gone the way he expected. He said something into the phone and hung up. "Officer Drake," he said. "Not happy to see him." "The tip you gave me," Drake said. "The supply discrepancy. Walk me through it again." "I already gave a statement. Walk me through it again." Plum shifted in his chair. He was a man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with the soft, slightly defensive bearing of someone who managed systems rather than people, and preferred it that way. He wore a lanyard with 3 separate badge IDs, which Drake clocked without saying anything. "3 weeks ago I pulled the quarterly inventory audit," Plum said. "Military liaison supplies. Those are a separate category, federally designated. We track them differently. I noticed a discrepancy between the count on file and the physical count. About 7 units of various trauma kit components. And you connected this to Brooks how? The badge access log. Her badge showed entry to the supply corridor on 2 evenings outside standard nursing access hours. Her badge, or her personally?" Plum paused. It was a short pause, but it was there. "The badge ID." Drake looked at him. "Is it possible someone else used her badge?" That would be against protocol." "I didn't ask about protocol. I asked if it's possible." Plum's eyes went to the surface of his desk and came back up. "Badge sharing does occur occasionally. It shouldn't, but who requested the audit?" "I run them quarterly. It's standard. This specific audit, 3 weeks ago, outside the standard quarterly schedule. Who requested it?" The pause this time was longer. "It was flagged by the hospital administrator's office, Dr. Ren Alcott's office." Drake wrote nothing down. He didn't have a notepad out. He was watching Plum's face. "Did Dr. Alcott tell you what triggered the flag?" She said there had been a concern raised through an anonymous tip. Internal. Someone had reported possible irregularities. "Did you see the tip?" "I don't know. It was handled through her office. Did you verify the supply discrepancy independently? Physical count, not just a paper audit? Another pause, shorter this time, but loaded. The audit showed physical count, Drake said. Did you personally go into that supply room and count the units? Plum's jaw moved. No, I authorized someone else to verify. Who? One of the supply clerks. I'd have to check. I need that name, Drake said. Today. He left the office the way he'd entered it, without ceremony, and stood in the east corridor for a moment looking at the wall while the shape of something considerably worse than a bad morning assembled itself around him. He'd been used. That was the specific, unpleasant word for it. Someone had handed him a package, and the package had looked clean, and he had carried it where they'd pointed him. And now his name was attached to the arrest of a woman who had apparently spent part of her life doing things in places that warranted 4 armored vehicles and a colonel showing up to a regional hospital in Montana before 9 in the morning. He pulled out his phone and called the station, not Holloway's line, the records desk. I need a complete internal access log for the Silver Ridge Supply Corridor B, he said, last 90 days, and I need the personnel file request for Evelyn Brooks, full background, military records, everything clearance allows, not what's publicly accessible, everything. The desk officer on the other end was quiet for a moment. That's going to need authorization above my level. Get it, Drake said. Tell them it's in connection with this morning's incident. They'll know which one. He hung up and stood there with his phone in his hand and the corridor quiet around him, and he thought about the moment in the parking lot when Brooks had looked at him and said calmly, without anger, without fear, "You're making a mistake." She hadn't been asking him to stop. She'd been telling him something factual, and he'd laughed at her. Oh. Colonel Marsh found Evelyn in the break room on the first floor at 10:45. She was sitting at the table with both hands around a cup of coffee that had been hot when someone gave it to her and was now approaching room temperature. She was looking at the middle distance. He sat down across from her. He was a big man, and the break room chairs were not designed for big men, but he settled into it without comment. 3 in surgery, he said. 2 stable and improving. 1, the one in Bay 5. They're talking about extubation in the next hour. His airway's going to need monitoring overnight, she said. The blast pressure damage isn't always visible in the first imaging. I've told the ICU team. She nodded. She drank the coffee. It was bad coffee. They sat for a moment without talking, which was a particular kind of quiet. Not uncomfortable, not loaded, just 2 people on the far side of something that had required a lot of them. Drake's been recalled to the station, Marsh said. I heard. You're going to need to give a statement about the arrest, procedurally. I know. The JAG office is already involved. The supply room allegation is going to be investigated formally. She looked at him. The kit in my trunk is mine. It's been mine for 3 years. I know that. We know that. The investigation will confirm it. What happened with the access log? Marsh picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. Preliminary read is that your badge was used twice in that corridor outside your shift. On both nights, you were documented elsewhere in the hospital at the same time. She absorbed that. Alibied by the hospital's own system. Yes. So whoever filed the report and used my badge to do it didn't check whether I was actually in the building those nights. That is what it looks like. She was quiet for a moment. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. Who filed the anonymous tip to Alcott's office? That, Marsh said, is what the investigation is going to find out. She nodded slowly. The break room hummed with the sound of the refrigerator and the faint ambient noise of a hospital that had absorbed a crisis and was now processing it, the machinery of care continuing around the event the way rivers continue around a rock. You should have told someone, Marsh said. Not accusatory. Matter of fact. She looked at him. About your background, your record. You've been here 3 years and nothing in your personnel file indicates, I know what's in my personnel file. Why? She set the cup down. She looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked at him in the direct way she had, the way that was habit from a life that had required accurate assessment of people quickly. Because I left, she said. I wasn't medically discharged. I wasn't forced out. I left because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't that. And you can't be somewhere that isn't that if that follows you around in your personnel file. Marsh didn't say anything. He understood the math of that. I know this morning changed things, she said. It did. Whatever that means. He looked at her. It means you can't put the information back in the box. She nodded. She picked up the coffee cup and drank the last of it, cold and bad, and didn't make a face. I should go check on Bay 3, she said. Evelyn. She stopped. What happened this morning, Marsh said, was not an accident. The tip, the audit, the timing, all of it. Someone in this hospital wanted you out of the building. What I can't tell you yet is why. She looked at him from the doorway. Her expression was the expression of someone to whom this information had arrived. Not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something she had not yet let herself look at directly. I know, she said. She went back to the trauma bay. Behind her, Marsh sat with his empty cup and looked at the wall. And on his phone, which he had turned face up on the table, a message from his intelligence liaison blinked with a green notification light. It was 3 lines long. He read it twice. He called a number from memory, and when the voice on the other end answered, he said, I need everything you have on Dr. Ren Alcott, current hospital administrator, Silver Ridge Medical Center, Raven Falls, Montana, and I need it in the next 2 hours. He paused while the voice spoke. Because, he said, I think she wasn't just trying to embarrass a nurse. The intelligence liaison's name was Captain Dora Selvey, and she had been running background investigations for the Army's Medical Command Oversight Division for 6 years, which meant she was very good at finding things that people had taken deliberate steps to make unfindable. She called Marsh back in 94 minutes. He stepped out of the trauma bay corridor and into the stairwell where it was quiet, and he listened for 4 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, Send me the file. He paused. All of it, not the summary. He stood in the stairwell for a moment after he hung up, looking at the concrete wall in front of him with the expression of someone recalculating the weight of a structure they'd thought they understood. Then he went to find Dr. Fiel. Fiel was in his office with the door closed. Marsh knocked once and opened it without waiting. Fiel was at his desk. Dr. Ren Alcott was standing near the window. She was 56, slim, dressed in the careful way of administrators who understood that appearance was a form of authority, and she turned when Marsh entered with the practiced composure of someone who had been expecting this and had been preparing for it. Colonel Marsh, she said, I was going to come find you. Dr. Alcott, he looked at Fiel. I need to speak with you, both of you. Fiel glanced between them. Should I? Stay, Marsh said. He closed the door. He did not sit down. I've been reviewing the supply audit that preceded Nurse Brooks's arrest this morning, he said. I want to understand the timeline. The anonymous tip to your office. When did you receive it? Alcott's expression stayed level. About 4 weeks ago. An internal notification through our ethics reporting system. I followed standard protocol, forwarded it to facilities for investigation. Did you know who submitted it? The system is anonymous by design. Did you try to find out? A beat. Small, but present. I trusted the process. The process, Marsh said, resulted in a nurse being arrested in the parking lot on a morning when a highway explosion produced 11 military casualties who required her specific expertise to survive. I'd like to understand whether that timing was coincidental. The room was very quiet. I don't know what you're implying, Alcott said. I'm not implying anything yet. I'm asking questions. Did you have any prior knowledge of the Route 12 military convoy? Of course not. Did you know about the logistics exercise in the Bitterroot Range? No. Did anyone contact you in the past 2 weeks about Nurse Brooks's background or her military record? Alcott's chin lifted slightly. Her personnel file shows no military service. That's what we have on file. That's not what I asked. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is used to being the one who manages things, and is finding that the usual levers are not connected to the usual machinery. I think, she said, this conversation should involve legal counsel. I think that's probably right, Marsh said. He looked at Fiel. The JAG office will be reaching out formally this afternoon. I'd recommend your full cooperation. He left them there and went back into the corridor, and then he went to find Evelyn. She was in Bay 3. The soldier, Corporal Tate Renner, 22, from a town outside Tulsa, was propped up at a slight angle, conscious, with better color than he'd had 2 hours ago. His IV was running and his expression mixed confusion with the exhausted relief of someone who had recently understood they were not going to die today. Evelyn was at the foot of the bed reviewing his chart. She wasn't doing anything dramatic. She was doing what she'd been doing all morning, methodical, steady, working through the next thing that needed doing. Marsh stood in the doorway. Renner looked at him, then at Evelyn, then back at Marsh. "You the one who got her out?" His voice was rough, not fully recovered. "Yes," Marsh said. Renner looked at Evelyn. "They arrested you?" "This morning," she said without looking up from the chart. "Before you came here." "Before I came here." He was quiet for a moment, processing this with the deliberate effort of someone whose brain was still operating under medication and blood loss. "That's messed up," he said finally. "It is," she agreed. She made a note on the chart, clicked the pen, looked up at him. "Your potassium's low. We're going to run a supplement through the IV, which is going to feel weird in your arm for a few minutes. Don't try to pull it out." "I know what low potassium feels like," he said. "Good." She moved to the supply cart. "Then you know not to pull it out." He almost smiled. He had the face of someone who smiled easily under normal circumstances, and the attempt at it now was effortful but genuine. "You always like this?" "Like what?" "Like nothing bothers you." She pulled what she needed from the cart and came back to the bedside. "Things bother me," she said. "I just do the next thing first." Renner looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his arm. "Okay," he said. "Do the next thing." Marsh watched from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He waited until she'd finished and stepped back from the bed, and then he said, "Evelyn, when you have a minute." She came out. They stood in the corridor out of earshot. "Selvey sent the file," he said quietly. "On Alcott." She waited. 18 months ago, Alcott applied for a position as medical operations director at a private defense contracting company, Viridian Health Systems. They run contracted medical support for military installations. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. She didn't get it. She got to the final round and was passed over. The reason documented in the selection file was that the review committee felt she lacked sufficient expertise in military trauma protocols to oversee the contract's operational scope. He paused. The committee's recommendation cited the need for personnel with demonstrated combat medical experience. The corridor hummed around them. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm. "She knew what I was," Evelyn said. "We don't have proof of that yet. What we have is a timeline. Alcott is passed over for a position she wanted badly. The stated reason maps directly to the kind of experience you have, and 4 months later, an anonymous tip appears in her ethics system accusing you of theft. No name on the tip. No physical evidence. Just a badge access log that anyone with administrative override could have manipulated." Evelyn looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Gary Plum didn't generate that audit himself. Plum says the flag came from Alcott's office. Alcott says she received an anonymous tip and followed process. Somewhere between those two statements is the actual sequence of events, and the JAG team is going to find it." "What about Drake?" "Drake is—" Marsh paused. "Complicated. He moved on bad information, and he moved on it fast, and some of that is his own record of how he operates. But he may also have been pointed. We're looking at who he had contact with in the week before the arrest." She absorbed this. She looked at the wall, at the scuff marks on the baseboard where gurneys had clipped it over the years, at the unremarkable physical reality of a hospital corridor that had been her daily environment for 3 years, and was now something slightly different, a location inside a larger situation she hadn't chosen. "What does this mean for me?" she said, not plaintively, practically. "It means you're not going anywhere," Marsh said. "Not today, not because of this." She nodded slowly. "And the rest of it?" He knew what she meant. The rest of it was everything she'd left in the separate room. The file that Selvey had assembled, the one that didn't appear in Silver Ridge's personnel records, the full version of Evelyn Brooks, which was considerably more than what anyone in Raven Falls had been given access to. "That's going to come out," he said. "I can't stop that now." "I know." "I'm sorry." She looked at him. "Don't be, just—" She stopped. "Make sure it comes out right." He nodded. He understood what she meant. The truth of something and the version of the truth that gets told in a hospital corridor by people who weren't there were not always the same thing, and she had spent 3 years making herself into a person whose story didn't precede her, and she was asking him to respect that even as it ended. "I'll do what I can," he said. She went back inside Bay 3. By noon, the surgical team had completed the first of the two major operations. Dr. Hartman came out of the OR with the contained energy of someone who had done something difficult and done it well, and the first person he looked for was Evelyn, who was in the corridor outside the ICU. "She's stable," he said. "Better than stable. The hemorrhage was contained. Another 20 minutes and it would have been a different conversation." Evelyn nodded. She was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, not from attitude but from tiredness. The posture of a body that had been running on adrenaline and bad coffee since before 6 that morning and was beginning to notice the deficit. "The procedure you outlined," Hartman said. "The approach to the secondary bleed site. Where did you learn that?" She looked at him. Hartman was 61, had trained at Johns Hopkins, had performed surgeries in 3 countries, and was not a man who asked questions out of politeness. I was asking because he genuinely didn't know and genuinely wanted to. "Forward Surgical Unit," she said. "Kandahar, 2018. He was quiet for a moment, reassembling something in his understanding. "I've read about that approach in literature," he said. "I've never seen it applied." "It works better than it reads," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else and wasn't quite sure how to frame it. What he landed on was, "Thank you for this morning." She accepted that with a small nod. He went to write his post-op notes. Wotet. At 12:40, Mason Drake walked back into Silver Ridge Medical Center. He was not in uniform. He had gone home. He lived 20 minutes from the hospital, a rented house on the edge of Raven Falls that he'd occupied for 2 years, and changed into civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a gray jacket. And he'd left his service weapon in the lockbox because he was not here in any official capacity. His badge was still on his belt, which was habit, but Captain Holloway had called twice more, and both times Drake had let it go to voicemail, which he understood was accelerating whatever was coming, but which felt necessary right now. He went to the front desk. The security guard, Harv Odom, who recognized him, looked at him with the particular wariness of someone who had seen the morning unfold and was not sure what category this visit fell into. "I need to speak with Nurse Brooks," Drake said. Harv picked up the desk phone. 5 minutes later, Evelyn came through the door from the corridor behind the desk. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the parking lot, with that quality of seeing the full picture of something quickly and without drama. She was still in the same scrubs. Her badge was still flagged in the system, so she'd been operating all morning on a temporary override Fail had authorized, and her name tag was the generic white kind they gave to temps and visitors. She stopped about 6 feet away from him. He said, "I need to talk to you." "Okay," she said. Not welcoming, not hostile, just acknowledging. "Not here." She looked at Harv. Harv looked at her. She said, "Conference room B is open." They went to conference room B, which was a small windowless space on the ground floor used for family meetings and departmental briefings, with a table that seated 8 and chairs that were slightly better than the plastic ones in the waiting room. She sat down. He sat across from her. He didn't take out a notepad or a recorder. She noticed that. "I made a mistake this morning," he said. She waited. "I moved on information I hadn't fully verified. He stopped, started again. "I know that doesn't fix what happened." "No," she said. "It doesn't. I'm trying to understand how the information got to me, the tip, the audit, all of it. I think you were set up." She looked at him steadily. "I know I was set up." "By who?" "I think you know the answer to that better than I do right now. You've been in the building for the last hour." He had, in fact, spent 40 minutes before coming to the front desk in the parking lot, and then the East Corridor, and then a very uncomfortable conversation with Gary Plum that had ended with Plum asking for his own lawyer. "Plum didn't generate the audit on his own," Drake said. "No." "And the anonymous tip to Alcott's office came from inside the building," Evelyn said, "or from someone who understood the building's systems well enough to make it look like it did." Drake looked at the table. He had the expression of someone who was used to being the most certain person in a room and was finding the experience of uncertainty genuinely uncomfortable. "Your background," he said. "Your background," he said. "The military record." "What about it?" "I should have run a deeper check." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked up at her. Why didn't you say something in the parking lot when I told you, she said. I told you twice. You laughed at me. The words sat between them without malice, which somehow made them more accurate. He had laughed. He remembered it. The specific, satisfied sound of someone who thought they understood the situation entirely. I'm going to do what I can to fix this, he said. The JAG investigation will fix it, she said. What you can do is give them everything you have. Plum, whatever contact you had before this morning, anyone who pointed you toward me specifically, all of it. That might complicate my own position. She looked at him. I know. He held the look for a moment, then he nodded. She stood up. She was at the door when he said, For what it's worth, what you did this morning, the soldiers. Don't, she said. Not unkindly, but clearly. Just give them everything you have. She left him there. The two-star general arrived at Silver Ridge at 2:15 in the afternoon. His name was Major General Harlan Voss, and he was 63, gray-haired, with the compact and deliberate bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades making decisions in conditions that did not reward hesitation. He traveled with a small staff and did not announce himself in the way that officials sometimes announce themselves, with an advance retinue and the performative machinery of importance. He walked through the front entrance with 2 aides and went directly to where Marsh was waiting. They shook hands in the way of people who had worked together in contexts that didn't require explanation. How bad was it? Voss said. We didn't lose anyone, Marsh said. That's directly due to Brooks. Voss nodded. He looked around the lobby, at the soldiers still moving through the building, at the nurses watching from behind the desk, at the general quality of a hospital that had absorbed something large and was still processing it. Where is she? ICU floor, checking on a patient. And Alcott? In her office. Her lawyer arrived 40 minutes ago. Selby's report? You've read it? On the plane. Voss looked at him. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone understood the convoy schedule, understood the response timeline, and built this around it. The anonymous tip came 4 weeks ago, Marsh said. The convoy schedule for the Bitterroot exercise was finalized 6 weeks ago. Those dates don't overlap by accident. Voss was quiet for a moment, the focused quiet of someone sorting information into actionable categories. Where did Alcott get the convoy schedule? That's what we don't have yet. Get it. He looked toward the elevator. I want to speak with Brooks.
What?
They found her in the ICU corridor outside the room where the female soldier from Bay 1, Specialist Raya Odom, was resting post-surgery. Evelyn was going over the post-op notes with the ICU charge nurse, a methodical conversation about monitoring parameters and fluid management and the specific things to watch for overnight. She didn't look up when they came around the corner, and then she did. And for a moment the corridor held the particular stillness of a situation that had been building toward a specific point. Voss stopped about 2 feet away from her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the lobby, assessing, precise, and then he did something that nobody else in the corridor was expecting. He came to attention. It was not theatrical. It was not performed for the staff who had stopped to watch, or for Marsh, or for the aides behind him. It was the specific, formal, completely genuine gesture of a senior officer acknowledging a record that warranted acknowledgement, and when he rendered the salute, it was the kind that meant something. Evelyn stood very still. The ICU corridor was completely quiet. Voss held it for a beat, and then he said, Lieutenant Brooks, on behalf of the United States Army, I owe you an apology. What happened to you this morning was a failure of the systems that should have protected you, and I am here to correct that personally. Evelyn's expression moved through something complicated and fast. Not tears, not collapse, just the very human moment of a person receiving something they had stopped expecting and did not quite know where to put. Sir, she said, her voice was steady. Almost. What you did in this building today, Voss said, is consistent with every documented action in your service record. I want you to know that record is known. It is respected. And the people in this building are going to know it too. He lowered the salute. Evelyn's hands were loose at her sides. She looked at him for a moment, then past him at Marsh, and then at the wall. And then she brought her eyes back to Voss, and something in her settled, not dramatically, not with any performance of it, just the small, specific settling of someone who has been carrying something a long way and has just been given permission to set it down for a moment. Thank you, sir, she said. There's more, Voss said. The JAG team has a development. You need to hear it. She looked at him. Now? Now. The conference room they used this time was larger, the second-floor meeting room, the one used for board presentations and major departmental reviews, with windows that looked out over the parking lot, where, 7 hours ago, Drake had locked her wrists behind her back in front of 200 people. The JAG officer was a lean woman named Major Petra Solano, who had the organized efficiency of someone who processed information in clean columns. She had been in Raven Falls since 11 that morning, moving through the building with a tablet and a portable scanner, and the particular authority of someone whose jurisdiction made most institutional politics irrelevant. She put 4 documents on the table. The anonymous tip to Dr. Alcott's ethics system, she said, was submitted from a device registered to the Silver Ridge Medical Center Administrator's Office. The IP address is internal. The submission timestamp is 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, which is outside standard business hours. File sitting at the table looked at the document. That's not conclusive. Multiple people have access to admin devices. The content of the tip, Solano said, included specific details about Nurse Brooks's badge access to Supply Corridor B. Those details were accurate to within a 2-hour window. The only personnel with the access privileges to pull that level of detail from the badge system without generating an audit flag are the IT administrator and the hospital administrator herself. She put a second document on top of the first. The IT administrator, a man named Kelso Pruitt, was on medical leave for 6 weeks beginning 3 months ago. His system access was suspended during that leave, which means the badge access query was run from the administrator's credentials. The room was quiet. Field said, Wren ran the query herself. That's what the system log shows, Solano said. She could say someone else used her credentials. She could, Solano said, and that argument becomes significantly more complicated by the third document. She placed it. This is a communication record from a private email account associated with Dr. Alcott. It was obtained pursuant to a federal warrant issued 2 hours ago. On the 14th of last month, she received an email from an address registered to a Viridian Health Systems subsidiary. The email contained 1 line of text. She turned the document so the room could read it. The line read, "The convoy date is confirmed. Route 12. Thursday, October 24th, 0800 departure." The room absorbed this. Evelyn was looking at the document. Her face was doing nothing visible, which meant, for those who knew her, that she was doing something considerable internally. Someone at Viridian gave her the convoy schedule, Marsh said. Yes, Solano said, and she built the timeline around it, the tip, the audit, the call to Drake. All of it designed to have Brooks removed from the building on the specific morning when her absence would cost the most lives. Why? Field said. He was looking at Alcott's name on the document like he was still trying to make it not be there. Why would she? Viridian's contract with the Army Medical Command is up for renewal in February, Solano said. The renewal is contingent on a performance review of their trauma response capacity. If Silver Ridge had failed to adequately treat the convoy casualties this morning, if soldiers had died because the hospital lacked the expertise to handle blast injuries, the review would have reflected poorly on the Army's regional contract structure and created pressure to route future contracts to Viridian's network, where Alcott has been promised a senior directorship upon the contract's execution. The silence this time was different from the previous silences. It had weight in it that the others hadn't. Field said, she was willing to let soldiers die. That is what the evidence suggests, Solano said, without inflection. Evelyn pushed back from the table and stood up. She went to the window. She looked out at the parking lot, at the armored vehicles still positioned near the entrance, at the ordinary machinery of a hospital Thursday afternoon, at the space near the employee lot where her Subaru was still parked, where everything had started at 7:15 that morning. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then she turned from the window and looked at Solano. What happens now? Solano gathered the documents. Dr. Alcott will be placed under federal detention within the hour. The Viridian contact is being identified. We expect additional arrests before end of day. Evelyn nodded. She looked at Voss. He was watching her with the measured attention of someone who understood that the moment they were in had cost her something she would have preferred not to pay. Is there anything you need? He said. She thought about it. The question was genuine, and she treated it that way, actually considering it rather than deflecting. "The soldier in Bay 5, she said. "Corporal Daniels. I want to be there when they extubate. Make sure it's done right." Voss looked at her for a moment. "Then go," he said. She was at the door when Major Solano's tablet issued a single sharp notification tone. Solano looked at it. Her expression, which had been professionally neutral for the past 40 minutes, changed by a small but readable degree. "Colonel Marsh," she said. He looked at her. "The Viridian contact," she said. "The person who gave Alcott the convoy schedule." She looked up from the tablet. "It's not an employee, it's a board member." She turned the tablet around. The name on the screen was not one that anyone in the room had expected, and the reason it landed the way it did was because it was a name that two people in that room recognized from a completely different context. Not Viridian, not defense contracting, not anything that should have connected to a hospital administrator in Raven Falls, Montana. Evelyn had stopped in the doorway. She was looking at the name on the tablet from 10 feet away, and the expression on her face was one that Marsh had seen on her exactly once before, in a completely different country, in a completely different year, in a moment that had preceded one of the worst nights of both of their professional lives. "Evelyn," Marsh said. She didn't answer immediately. She was still looking at the name. When she turned, her face had the quality of someone who has just watched two separate threads of their life converge at a point they hadn't seen coming and cannot immediately process the full shape of what that convergence means. "I know that name," she said. "I know that name," she said, and the way she said it made Marsh go very still. The tablet in Solano's hand showed a name and a headshot pulled from a corporate board directory. The man in the photo was in his late 60s, white-haired, with the groomed and deliberate appearance of someone who had spent decades making himself look like the kind of person who sat on boards and signed things and was never in the room when the actual damage happened. His name was Reginald Holt. Evelyn was still in the doorway. She hadn't moved. Her right hand was on the doorframe, not gripping it, just resting there. But the posture of her whole body had shifted in the small, structural way that Marsh recognized from the one previous time he'd seen her encounter something she hadn't expected and needed a moment to contain. "Evelyn," he said again carefully. "Kandahar," she said. 2018. He was a civilian contractor liaison, DoD advisory capacity, officially. He was at the forward operating base for 3 weeks in March. Marsh looked at the photo on Solano's tablet. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at Evelyn. "The night of the ambush," he said. Not a question. "The route we took," she said. "The one that put us in the valley. That route was provided by his team, marked clear." She paused. It wasn't clear. The room had gone the specific kind of quiet that happens when people understand they are hearing the edge of something much larger than what they came in expecting to find. Voss had straightened in his chair. "What was the outcome?" Evelyn looked at him. 4 soldiers. 3 came back. She said it the way people say the things they've organized into manageable containers, factually, at a slight remove because the alternative was not functional. The investigation was closed without findings. Contractor involvement was not pursued. "Why not?" Phil said. "I was the only civilian in the room," and he asked it with the genuine bafflement of someone who didn't know how these things worked. Nobody answered him immediately. Marsh said, "Solano, how long has Holt been on Viridian's board?" Solano was already running it. 4 years. Joined 8 months after leaving DoD advisory work. What was his DoD role? Logistics and route coordination, theater-level contracts. Marsh looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the wall now, at nothing specific, with the expression of someone doing math they've been avoiding for a long time and have just been forced to sit down and finish. "He knew what the route would do," she said. It wasn't accusatory. It was the tone of someone completing a sentence they'd started in a different country 7 years ago. And then he spent 4 years on a defense company's board, and nobody connected it. "Until now," Solano said. Evelyn looked at her. Until now. Solano made 3 calls in the next 11 minutes. Evelyn sat in the conference room while she made them, which was not something she'd planned. She'd been going to Bay 5 to be there for Daniels's extubation, but her legs had made a different decision and she'd let them. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance, and she breathed in the deliberate, controlled way that she'd learned to breathe a long time ago, when breathing on purpose was sometimes the only thing inside her own authority. Renata Voss, The night shift nurse who had watched the arrest that morning, hand over her mouth, came to the conference room door at some point and stood there for a moment and then came in and set a bottle of water and a granola bar on the table next to Evelyn without saying anything, which was the most useful thing anyone had done for her in several hours. Evelyn looked at her. Thank you, she said. Renata nodded. She started to leave. Renata, the woman stopped. This morning, in the parking lot, I know that was hard to watch. Renata turned around. She had the look of someone who had been carrying the discomfort of her own inaction all day and had not found a good place to put it. I should have said something, she said. There wasn't anything to say that would have changed it. I still should have. Evelyn held her look for a moment. Yeah, she said. Probably. She said it without cruelty, which meant it landed as something more useful than absolution. It landed as the truth, which was what Renata actually needed. Go back to the floor. I'll be there in a few minutes. Renata left. Evelyn ate the granola bar, which was chalky and slightly stale, and drank half the water, and then she sat for another moment in the particular silence of someone who has just had the map of a long-ago event redrawn and is working out what that changes about the terrain they're currently standing on. What it changed, specifically, was this. The ambush in 2018 had not been a random catastrophic failure of intelligence. It had been a corridor, and the corridor had been built, and the man who had built it had spent the intervening 7 years accumulating wealth and board seats, and the particular immunity of people who remain adjacent to power without appearing to exercise it. And now, through a chain of decisions that had begun with Ren Alcott's professional bitterness and a convoy schedule and a parking lot arrest, that man's name was on a federal tablet in a Montana hospital conference room, and someone was finally asking the right questions. She stood up. She went to Bay 5 Chad. Corporal Aaron Daniels was 24 and had the build of someone who had been athletic before the military and had gotten more so after. And when the ICU team began the extubation process at 3:40 in the afternoon, he was awake enough to be frightened by it, which was actually a good sign medically and a hard thing to watch personally. Evelyn stood at the bedside and talked him through it the way she'd talked people through it before, in places where the equipment was worse and the lighting was worse, and there was no clean corridor outside with family waiting. She told him what each sensation would be in the order it would happen, and she told him the worst part and when it would end, and when it was over and he was breathing on his own and his eyes were streaming from the reflex of it, she handed him a tissue from the box on the bedside table. You're good, she said. You're doing it yourself. He took the tissue. I was trying to say something. His throat was too raw for it yet. Don't try to talk, she said. Give it 10 minutes. He nodded. He looked at her with the raw, unguarded gratitude of someone who has just come through something and hasn't yet rebuilt the social surface over it. It was the kind of look that was hard to receive gracefully, and she received it the way she received most things, steadily, without deflecting it, and without letting it knock her off balance. She stayed until the ICU nurse had completed the post-extubation assessment and Daniels's numbers were stable, and he had managed to say, in a voice like gravel and rust, "Thank you." Then she stepped out. In the corridor, Marsh was waiting. He had his phone in his hand and the expression of someone who has just gotten off a call that moved things forward. Holt's been located, he said. He was in Denver. Flew in for a Viridian board meeting 2 days ago. FBI field office picked him up an hour ago. She nodded. There's more. When they executed the warrant on his devices, they found communication records going back 3 years. Not just Alcott. There are 2 other incidents in 2 other states where contractor personnel with specific military trauma expertise were sidelined before Army contract reviews. Different methods each time. Holt's been running a pattern. She stood with that for a moment. How many people knew? At Viridian? We don't know yet. The board is being audited. He paused. Holt's attorney is already trying to negotiate. He's claiming he was acting on bad information, that he didn't know Alcott would escalate to involving law enforcement. He gave her the convoy schedule. Yes. There's no version of that where he didn't know what he was setting up. I agree, Marsh said. So does the FBI. She looked down the corridor toward the ICU rooms, at the ordinary busyness of a hospital afternoon that had absorbed the extraordinary morning and was continuing around it the way hospitals always continued. What about Drake? Marsh's expression shifted slightly. He gave Solano everything, the contact from Plum, the call to his personal cell, the timeline. He also found the supply clerk Plum used to run the physical count, a temporary worker who has since left Silver Ridge. The count was falsified. The supplies were never actually missing. Plum knew that. Plum knew that. He's cooperating fully for what that's worth. She thought about Drake in the conference room that morning, saying, "I made a mistake with the particular discomfort of someone who was used to being right and was encountering the specific cost of not being right in a way that had consequences for someone other than himself." It wasn't an excuse, but it was a human thing, and she was still capable of distinguishing between human failure and deliberate harm, even when she was the one who had paid for the failure. "What happens to him?" she said. "That's above my authority," Marsh said. "What I can tell you is that his cooperation is noted, and what he did this morning, regardless of the circumstances that produced it, is documented and will be reviewed." She nodded. "It should be." "Yes," he said. "It should." At 4:30, Dr. Ren Alcott was walked out of Silver Ridge Medical Center through the administrative entrance on the north side of the building. She was not in handcuffs yet. That came after the processing, after the formal federal charges were filed, and the federal agents with her were courteous in the rote, impersonal way of people executing a procedure. But the effect was the same. 2 agents, one on each side, and the particular walk of someone who has run out of room. She had not said anything to her attorney in the last hour that was useful to her case. Her attorney had said plenty, but Alcott herself had gone quiet in the way people go quiet when the architecture they've built around themselves has come apart, and there isn't any language yet for the space where it used to be. Gary Plum saw her from the second-floor window of his office. He was sitting at his desk with his own attorney on the phone, and he watched her walk to the federal vehicle without letting himself look away from it, because some part of him understood that he was responsible for a portion of this, and looking away would have been a small cowardice on top of a larger one. The day shift charge nurse, a woman named Adele Pruitt, who had worked at Silver Ridge for 19 years, and who had been managing the administrative chaos of the day with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen administrations come and go and knew that institutions survived individuals if the people inside them did their jobs, watched from the main nursing station. She didn't say anything. She turned back to the board and noted 2 patients due for reassessment and called the appropriate nurse and went on with the afternoon. Phil saw it from his window, the same window he'd stood at that morning when the military vehicles came through the entrance. He watched Alcott get into the vehicle, and he stood there for a moment with his hand on the window frame, and he thought about the conversation he'd had with her at 7:30 that morning, when she'd called him about the arrest and said, carefully, "I think we have to let the process play out, Marcus." And he'd agreed, carefully, because she was his administrator and the process had seemed reasonable. He thought about what letting the process play out had nearly cost. He went back to his desk. He had a lot of calls to make, and most of them were going to be unpleasant, and all of them were necessary. The part that nobody outside the administrative floor saw, the part that would eventually matter more than the visible removal of an administrator, was the document trail. Solano's team spent 4 hours on the 14th floor of the county federal building and another 3 hours at Silver Ridge's IT infrastructure before they had the full sequence. What they found was not a single decision, but a series of them, each one small enough to seem deniable in isolation and devastating in aggregate. Alcott had run the badge query herself, from her own credentials, at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, using the administrator's override that bypassed the standard audit log. She had extracted Evelyn's specific access records for Corridor B and compared them against shift documentation in a way that required knowing what she was looking for, which meant she had known about Evelyn's background before the anonymous tip, had known or had been told. The email from Holt's subsidiary account with the convoy schedule had arrived 14 days before the arrest. On the day it arrived, Alcott had made 3 phone calls from her personal cell, none of them to numbers registered in her standard contacts. One of those numbers belonged to Gary Plum's personal cell. One belonged to a number that came back to a prepaid device that had since been deactivated. The third belonged to a direct line at the Raven Falls Police Department, not the main line, not dispatch, but an internal extension that, according to department records, had been assigned to Mason Drake. Solano noted this without comment in the official report. Drake had already disclosed the call in his cooperation statement, which was the only reason it was a mitigating factor rather than an aggravating one. He had received a call from an unrecognized number on his personal extension and the caller had given him Plum's name and told him to follow up on the supply discrepancy. And he hadn't thought to question why a stranger had called a direct line that wasn't publicly listed. He'd wanted the arrest. He'd been handed a reason to make one. He hadn't looked at the hand. The full picture, assembled from phone records and email metadata and badge logs and the falsified supply audit, and the testimony of the temporary clerk who had been paid in cash to run a count that wasn't a count, came to 47 pages. Solano submitted it to the federal prosecutor's office at 7:15 that evening, which meant that by the time the overnight shift started at Silver Ridge, the charges were being drafted. Mason Drake was at the station at 5 p.m. when Captain Holloway finally got him in person. Holloway was 60, compact, with 28 years on the force, and the particular quality of someone who had seen most things and had strong opinions about which ones mattered. He closed the door of his office and sat behind his desk and looked at Drake for a long moment without saying anything. Drake sat. He hadn't been in uniform since noon. He looked tired and slightly diminished in the specific way of people who have had a long, revelatory day. "The cooperation statement you gave the JAG officer," Holloway said. "Yes, sir." "You disclosed the call to your personal extension." "Yes, sir." "Before or after you knew they had the phone records?" Drake held his eye. "Before." Holloway studied him. "Why?" Drake thought about it honestly. "Because she told me to," he said. "Brooks. She told me to give them everything." He paused. "And because it was right." Holloway was quiet for a moment. "The body camera footage from this morning is going to the review board. The arrest procedure, the conduct in the parking lot, the processing, all of it." "I know." "The board will determine what comes next. That's out of my hands." "I understand." "Drake." Holloway leaned forward slightly. "The woman you arrested this morning held the line on 3 critical military casualties before 9 a.m. One of the soldiers she treated would have died without the specific intervention she performed. That is documented in the medical record, and it will be part of the public record of today." Drake looked at his hands. He looked at them for a long moment, at the hands that had put the cuffs on her in the parking lot with the pleased efficiency of someone making a career move. "I know," he said. "Go home," Holloway said. "Don't go anywhere. The board will be in touch." Drake stood. He was at the door when Holloway said, "For what it's worth," coming forward before they had the records. That was the right call. Drake didn't answer. He wasn't sure yet whether doing the right thing late was meaningfully different from not doing it at all, and he wasn't going to pretend he'd resolved that question. He went home. At 6 p.m., General Voss convened a formal briefing in the Silver Ridge second-floor conference room. It was not a large gathering. Marsh, Solano, 2 of Voss's aides, Phil, and Evelyn. But it had the quality of a significant meeting, the kind where what's said becomes part of the official record. Voss stood at the head of the table. He was not reading from notes. "Effective immediately," he said. "Nurse Evelyn Brooks's service record will be updated in the Army's personnel database to reflect her full commendation history. 3 letters of commendation, 2 unit citations, and a record notation for the 2018 Forward Operating Base incident that accurately reflects her actions that night. The previous notation, which cited operational failure without attribution, will be expunged." Evelyn was seated at the table. She looked at Voss steadily. "The 2018 investigation will be reopened," he continued, "under the new information obtained today regarding Reginald Holt's involvement in that theater's route coordination. The findings of the original review are being set aside. A new inquiry has been ordered." She had known this was coming, in the abstract way you know something is coming when you've watched the pieces align throughout the day, but hearing it said formally was different from knowing it abstractly. The 2 things lived in different parts of the body. "Is there anything you want to say for the record?" Voss asked. She thought about it. She was quiet for a moment. That wasn't hesitation. It was consideration, which was something different. 3 soldiers didn't come back from that valley, she said. "I'd like their families to know that it wasn't a failure of planning or execution on anyone's part on the ground. I'd like that to be part of the record." "It will be," Voss said. She nodded. She looked at the table. Then she looked up. "What's Holt saying?" Solano answered. "His attorney is still in negotiation posture. He's claiming limited knowledge of Alcott's methods, that he provided information in good faith for what he understood to be a legitimate competitive assessment." He gave her a military convoy schedule. He's claiming he believed it was for logistical planning purposes. Hospital surge readiness. The room's silence had a particular quality. He'll have a hard time making that work, Marsh said. He'll try, Solano said. Men like Holt always have a version where they were just adjacent to the problem. Evelyn looked at the table. Adjacent to the problem. She thought about the valley, the specific quality of the dark that night, and the sounds, and the three people who had been present at the start of the operation and were not present at the end of it. Adjacent. Make sure it doesn't work, she said. That's not up to any of us in this room, Solano said. But the evidence is what it is. 47 pages of it. The hospital quieted the way hospitals quiet in the early evening. Not silent, never silent, but the daytime's particular volume of institutional movement settling into the overnight rhythm. The lights in the main corridors stayed bright. The monitors continued. The work continued. Evelyn did a final round through the ICU at 7:30. Renner was sleeping. Odom, post-surgery, was stable and had eaten half a cup of broth, which the ICU nurse reported as a victory, which it was. Daniels was awake, his voice still rough, and he was watching something on his phone with the earbuds in. She stopped at his door. He pulled out one earbud. "How's the throat?" she said. "Terrible," he said. "Feels like I swallowed a road. That'll last a couple of days. Drink cold water." "My mom keeps calling," he said. "I don't know what to tell her." "Tell her you're okay. She's going to want details." "Tell her the details later. Tonight, just tell her you're okay." He looked at her. He had the same raw quality he'd had when they took the tube out, slightly reduced now by a few hours of sleep, but still present. "They told me what you did," he said. "This morning. The other guys." She waited. "That you got arrested and then came here anyway." "I came here because there were people who needed help," she said. "That's the whole story." "That's not the whole story," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He was 24 and he had nearly died today, and his throat felt like a road, and he was trying to say something true about what he understood had happened, and she decided not to redirect it. "No," she said. "It's not." She put the earbud back in his hand. "Sleep," she said. "The details can wait." She was in the main corridor pulling on her jacket. Someone had retrieved her bag from the locker room. Her car keys were in it. When her phone buzzed, she looked at it. Unknown number, which she normally ignored, but the area code was one she recognized from a different time. She answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, measured and direct, with the particular cadence of federal authority. "Lieutenant Brooks, this is Special Agent Dara Fenn, FBI Financial Crimes. I'm calling about Reginald Holt." A pause. "He's retained new counsel in the last 2 hours. His legal team has filed a motion to suppress the communication records on the basis of an irregular warrant application." Evelyn stopped walking. "If the motion is granted," Fenn continued, "the primary documentary evidence linking him to the convoy information is excluded. We would still have Alcott's testimony, but her cooperation is contingent on a deal that depends on Holt's prosecution proceeding." "What does that mean for the case?" "It means we need something independent of the communication records. Something that places Holt's knowledge of your background and your presence at Silver Ridge prior to the convoy schedule email." Evelyn stood in the corridor. The evening shift moved around her. A nurse passed with a medication cart. 2 residents walked by deep in conversation. The ordinary machinery of the place continued without reference to what she was standing in the middle of. "There's a name," she said slowly. "From 2018, a junior contractor on Holt's liaison team. He was present at the FOB during the week before the ambush. He filed an incident report after, one that contradicted the official timeline. The report was buried. Do you know where he is now?" She knew where he was. She had checked, 2 years after Raven Falls, in a moment of insomnia and unfinished business, and she had found him working for a logistics firm in Boise, and she had closed the browser and not gone back to it because the door that opened led somewhere she hadn't been ready to go. "I know where he is," she said. "We need to speak with him, tonight if possible." She looked at the ceiling of Silver Ridge Medical Center, at the institutional tile and the fluorescent lighting and the ordinary, unglamorous infrastructure of a place where people came when things went wrong, and some of them were saved and some were not. And she had spent 3 years here doing the saving without anyone knowing the full version of who was doing it. "I'll give you his name," she said, "and then I need to be on that call." There was a brief silence on the other end. "That's irregular," Fenn said. "I know," Evelyn said, "but he'll talk to me when he won't talk to you, and you need him to talk." Another silence. Longer. "Be available in an hour," Fenn said. The call ended. Evelyn stood in the corridor with her phone in her hand and her jacket half on, and she thought about a junior contractor in Boise who had filed a report that nobody read and had spent 7 years, presumably, carrying the same unresolved weight of a night in a valley that had ended the wrong way. She thought about the door she hadn't opened 2 years ago. She thought about what it meant that it was open now, and who had forced it open, and the particular bitter irony that Ren Alcott's ambition and Mason Drake's carelessness and Reginald Holt's careful distance from consequences had, in combination, produced the one morning that had made all of this impossible to ignore. She finished putting on her jacket. She walked to the elevator. The doors opened and she stepped in, and as they closed, she caught a glimpse of the main corridor, of the nurse's station and the board, and the ongoing ordinary urgency of a hospital Thursday night. And for a moment she stood in the closing elevator and felt the specific weight of a day that had begun with handcuffs in a parking lot and had arrived here, at this exact door, which was the door she had been avoiding for 2 years, and which was now, evidently, going to open whether she was ready or not. The elevator reached the ground floor. She walked out into the lobby and toward the exit, and when her phone buzzed again, she didn't hesitate before answering, because the man in Boise had a name, and the name was Marcus Gelt. And what Marcus Gelt knew about Reginald Holt was the thing that 7 years ago someone had made very sure would never reach the right people. It was about to reach them. Marcus Gelt answered on the second ring. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had been prepared for voicemail, for the hesitation of someone who didn't recognize the number and let it go, for the version of this where she had to call back twice and explain herself in stages. Instead, he picked up at ring 2 with a voice that was cautious but present, and when she said her name, the silence on the other end was not the silence of someone who didn't remember. It was the silence of someone who had been, on some level, waiting. "Brooks," he said. Just the name, like he was confirming something to himself. "Gelt." She was in the hospital parking lot, standing near her Subaru, the Montana night cold enough that she could see her breath. "I need to talk to you about Holt." Another silence, shorter. "How'd you find me?" "The same way you find anyone," she said. "I looked." "When?" 2 years ago. He absorbed that. She heard him moving, a door closing, the ambient sound of whatever room he'd been in becoming quieter. "He's been arrested," Gelt said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know that?" "I've had a Google alert on his name for 4 years," he said, and there was something in how he said it that was both slightly embarrassing and completely understandable. The behavior of someone who had been waiting for a specific thing to happen and had built a small private monitoring system around that waiting. "It fired 2 hours ago. FBI financial crimes, wire fraud, federal conspiracy." "There's a motion to suppress," Evelyn said. "His new attorney is trying to kill the communication records. If it works, the primary evidence linking him to the convoy information goes away. And the case falls apart. Alcott's cooperation is contingent on his prosecution moving forward. If he walks on the federal conspiracy, the whole structure collapses." She heard him breathing. She heard him thinking, which was a particular kind of quiet. "What do you need?" he said. "The report you filed," she said, "after the ambush, the one that contradicted the official timeline. That report was buried. The copy I had, they asked me to surrender it as part of the debriefing. I did." "Did you keep anything?" A pause long enough to mean something. "I kept the notes I made before I wrote the formal report," he said. "Handwritten, dates, times, the specific conversations I had with Holt's team about the route assessment. I kept them because I knew the formal report was going to get managed, and I wanted something that existed outside of their system." Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. The parking lot was quiet around her, the cold air clean in a way that Montana nights were clean, the mountains invisible in the dark, but present in the way they were always present. "Those notes," she said, "they place his knowledge of the route conditions before the operation. They document a conversation I had with one of his analysts 3 days before the ambush," Gelt said. "The analyst told me the route had been assessed as high risk. I reported that up through Holt's chain. The official assessment that went to your unit said the route was clear." He paused. "I was 26 years old and I filed the report And then I was told to focus on my current assignment, and I did, because I didn't know yet what it meant that nobody was asking follow-up questions. She understood that. The specific education of learning that the absence of follow-up questions was itself information. The notes are admissible as a prior recorded recollection, she said. If they're in your handwriting, dated contemporaneously, they establish independent documentary evidence of Holt's knowledge prior to the operation. That's separate from the communication records his attorney is trying to suppress. I know what they are, he said. I had a lawyer look at them 3 years ago. She told me they were potentially significant, but that without a federal case to attach them to, there was no mechanism. There's a mechanism now, Evelyn said. He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She was good at waiting, had learned it in conditions where impatience was a tactical liability. And she waited now in the dark parking lot with her breath visible in the cold air and her car keys in her hand, and 7 years of an unfinished thing pressing at the back of everything. 3 people didn't come home from that valley, Gelt said. I know. I think about them, he said. I don't know if that matters to you or not. It matters, she said, and meant it. Okay, he said. Tell me who to call. She gave him Fenn's number. She told him to mention her name and the case reference and to have the notes photographed and transmitted before midnight. He said he would. He said it in the tone of someone who had been carrying a specific thing for a long time and had just been handed a place to set it down, and she recognized that tone because she'd been using it herself, quietly, all day. Gelt, she said before he hung up. Yeah. Thank you. Don't, he said. Not unkindly. I should have pushed harder in 2018. We both know that. Maybe, she said, but you kept the notes. A silence. Then, yeah, I kept the notes. The call ended. She stood for another moment in the parking lot, and then she got in her car and drove home to the apartment on Caldwell Street and walked inside and sat on her couch in the dark for approximately 4 minutes. And then she lay down on top of the covers without taking off her shoes and slept for 6 hours without dreaming. Reginald Holt's attorney filed the suppression motion at 9 a.m. the following morning. By 11 a.m., it had been denied. The federal judge's ruling was 4 paragraphs and did not require elaborate language. The warrant application had been regular. The communications records stood. And now, supplementing them, were 23 pages of handwritten notes from a former junior contractor in Boise, Idaho, notes that had been photographed, transmitted, notarized, and received by the federal prosecutor's office at 11:47 the previous night, and which established, in the handwriting of a 26-year-old who had not yet learned to be cynical about what happened to inconvenient information, a clear and documented chain of knowledge that ran directly to Reginald Holt. Holt's attorney requested a recess to consult with his client. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When they came back, the attorney informed the court that his client wished to discuss the terms of a cooperation agreement. Special Agent Fenn called Evelyn at noon. He's talking, she said. Evelyn was in the Silver Ridge break room eating an actual meal for the first time in approximately 32 hours. A turkey sandwich from the cafeteria that was not good and that she was eating with the concentrated attention of someone refueling. How much? Everything, it looks like. He's giving us the Viridian board member who provided operational access to the other 2 incidents. He's giving us the contact at DOD who buried the 2018 investigation review. He's giving us the financial structure of the arrangement with Alcott. A pause. It's significant, Brooks. This doesn't end with him. I know, Evelyn said. She had known, from the moment she'd seen the 47 pages, that Holt was a node in something larger, not the architect of it, but a functional piece of it, the kind of piece that only becomes visible when the structure around it starts to come apart. The families of the 3 soldiers from 2018, Fenn said. Someone will need to notify them that the investigation is being reopened, that the official record is changing. I know, Evelyn said again. That's not going to fall to you. I want you to know that. The Army will handle the notifications formally. She looked at her sandwich. Okay. Is there anything you need from this office? She thought about it. Make sure Gelt is protected, she said. He kept those notes for 7 years. He cooperated immediately and completely. Whatever happens with the broader case, he shouldn't carry any exposure from 2018. Already noted, Fenn said. His attorney has been in contact. He's been formally designated a cooperating witness with corresponding protections. Good, she said. She finished the sandwich. It was still not good. She ate all of it. The Raven Falls Police Department's Professional Standards Review convened 4 days after the arrest. Mason Drake sat in front of a 3-member board in a room on the second floor of the station and answered questions for 2 hours. The body camera footage was reviewed. The arrest procedure was analyzed. The contact on his personal line from Alcott's device was documented. His cooperation statement, given voluntarily before the phone records were in evidence, was entered into the record. The board deliberated for 1 day. Their findings were conduct unbecoming, procedural violations in the arrest and processing of a civilian, and failure to exercise due diligence in verifying probable cause. Drake's record of prior complaints, 3 and 2 years, all alleging excessive exercise of authority in low-stakes situations, all previously dismissed, was reopened and factored into the overall assessment. He was suspended without pay pending further review. His service weapon and badge were surrendered. Captain Holloway delivered the findings personally in his office, which was a courtesy Drake had not necessarily earned, but which Holloway extended anyway, because he was the kind of department head who believed in delivering difficult things directly. Drake sat across from him and listened to the full reading without interruption. When it was done, he said, "Is there an appeal process?" "There is," Holloway said. "You have 30 days. Drake nodded. He looked at his hands again, which seemed to be where he put his eyes when he was processing something he didn't have language for yet. "I don't know if I'll use it," he said. Holloway looked at him. "That's up to you." "What would you do?" Drake said. It was a genuine question, not a deflection. Holloway was quiet for a moment. He had 28 years of decisions behind him, some of which he was proud of and some of which he was not. And he had the perspective that came from being far enough down the road to see the shape of choices you'd made when you were younger and more certain. "I think hard about what kind of officer I wanted to be," he said, "and whether the one I'd been up to now was that." Drake left the station at 2 in the afternoon in civilian clothes, without his badge, and drove home on autopilot and sat in his house for a long time doing the particular thinking that Holloway had suggested. It was not comfortable thinking, but it was the right kind. Ren Alcott was formally charged on day 3. 11 counts, including federal wire fraud, conspiracy to interfere with a military medical operation, misuse of administrative credentials, and obstruction. Her attorney negotiated a plea on 7 of the 11. She would serve a minimum of 6 years in federal custody. The hospital board convened an emergency session and voted unanimously to accept her resignation, a formality since she had been in federal custody since the afternoon of the arrest. But institutions require their paperwork. They also voted to commission an independent audit of all internal ethics reports filed in the past 3 years, and to implement a 2-factor verification system for administrative badge access queries. Gary Plum resigned the day before charges were formally filed against him. 4 counts of falsifying institutional records, 1 count of conspiracy. His attorney negotiated on his behalf, and his cooperation with the federal investigation, which had been immediate if not particularly courageous, was taken into account. He would serve 18 months and pay significant restitution to the hospital. The supply clerk, a 23-year-old named Darcy Pell, who had been paid $400 in cash to run a fake count and who had not fully understood at the time what she was participating in, was not charged. She gave a full statement and cried through most of it, and was advised by her own counsel that the cooperation had resolved her legal exposure. She got a job at a grocery distribution center in the next county and did not return to medical facility work. Reginald Holt pleaded guilty to federal conspiracy, wire fraud, and 1 count of providing material support to an action that resulted in the death of military personnel, a charge that had required careful construction by the prosecutor's office, but that the evidence, specifically Gelt's notes and the DoD contact Holt had identified in his cooperation, fully supported. His sentencing was scheduled for 4 months out. The prosecutor's office requested the maximum. His attorneys argued for mitigation. The judge would decide. The 3 families from 2018 were notified by a 2-star general and an Army chaplain in person on the same day in 3 different states. What was said in each of those houses was private. What the families received, formally and in writing, was a corrected record. Their soldiers had not died as the result of operational failure. They had died because of deliberately falsified route intelligence provided by a civilian contractor for financial reasons. And that contractor had now been prosecuted, and the record now said exactly what had happened. Whether that was sufficient, whether any formal record could be sufficient for the specific weight those families had been carrying for 7 years, was not something that had a clean answer. Truth is not the same as repair, but it is a beginning, and it is better than the alternative, which is the falsified version sitting in a file somewhere, unchallenged, permanent. On the 8th day after the arrest, Evelyn Brooks walked into a conference room on the 3rd floor of Silver Ridge Medical Center and sat across from the hospital board. There were 7 of them. They looked like what they were, a mix of medical professionals and community figures and one retired judge who served as board chair. And they had the slightly formal quality of a group that had spent the past week in a great deal of crisis management and was now trying to do something that felt like its opposite. The board chair, a woman named Harriet Bloom, who was 71 and had been practicing law for 43 years before her retirement, and who had the particular directness of someone who had run out of patience for imprecision sometime in her early 40s, led the session. "Nurse Brooks," she said, "I want to begin by saying that on behalf of this board, I'm sorry for what happened in this parking lot 8 days ago. That's an insufficient word for an insufficient situation, but I want it on record." "It's on record," Evelyn said. "The board has reviewed your complete service history, provided by the Army Medical Command. We've reviewed the events of the 14th, including the medical record of your interventions in the trauma bay. We've spoken with Colonel Marsh, Dr. Kiao, Dr. Hartman, and 4 members of the nursing staff." Evelyn waited. "We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Emergency Trauma Services," Bloom said. "It's a new position. The board voted to create it specifically. The role would carry full administrative authority over ER protocol development, trauma team training, and the hospital's military casualty response procedures, which, as the events of the 14th made very clear, were inadequate." Evelyn looked at the board. 7 faces, all watching her with a mixture of professional assessment and something more than that. Something that, in a group of institutional people, was as close to genuine reckoning as institutional people usually got. "The salary and terms will be provided in writing," Bloom continued. "You'll have time to review them, but I want to ask you, directly and off the record, is this something you want?" It was a good question, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was the kind of question that required honesty about things she'd been organizing into manageable containers for 3 years. And honesty has its own kind of weight. "I came to Raven Falls because I wanted to do the work without the weight of the record," she said. "I didn't want to be the veteran. I didn't want my background to be the reason someone listened to me or didn't listen to me." Bloom nodded. She didn't interrupt. "That's not available to me anymore," Evelyn said. "What happened 8 days ago made sure of that. So the question isn't whether I want to go back to being invisible. It's whether I want to use what's now visible for something useful." "And?" Bloom said. Evelyn looked at the table. Then she looked up. "I'll need to restructure the trauma bay protocol entirely," she said. "The current system has 3 points of failure that were visible to me on the 14th in the first 4 minutes. I'll need authority to implement changes without routing them through 4 administrative approval layers." "The position includes that authority," Bloom said. "I'll need to bring in outside training, military trauma instructors, the kind of scenarios civilian teams don't encounter until they're in them. Budgeted. And I'll need the supply chain for the military liaison room reporting directly to my office. Not facilities, not administration, my office." There was a small pause. "Done," Bloom said. Evelyn held her look for a moment. "Then yes," she said. "I want it." She started the following Monday. The first thing she did was walk the trauma bay with a legal pad and spend 2 hours writing down everything she would change, in the order she would change it. The second thing she did was call Dr. Chiao into her office, a small room 2 doors down from the trauma bay, with a window that looked into the ER corridor, and ask her to go through the same exercise independently so she'd have 2 sets of eyes on the same problems. Chiao came back with a list that overlapped with Evelyn's on 7 of 10 points, and diverged on 3 in ways that were interesting. They spent an hour working through the divergences. By the end of it, Chiao had changed her mind on 2 of her 3 points, and Evelyn had changed her mind on 1 of hers. "You're going to be good at this job," Chiao said on her way out. "I've never had a job like this," Evelyn said. Neither have I, Chow said. But I've worked under people who were bad at it and people who were good at it, and I can tell the difference in about 20 minutes. You've been in the building for 3 years. I should have paid closer attention. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more specific than an apology. It was a person with good judgment acknowledging that they'd had insufficient information and would have used it differently if they'd had it. Evelyn accepted it for what it was. Go see your patients, she said. Chow went. Corporal Tate Renner was discharged on day 6. He walked out of Silver Ridge under his own power, which the physio team counted as a significant victory given what his chest had looked like on the 14th. His mother had flown in from Oklahoma and was waiting in the lobby, a compact woman in her early 50s who hugged him for a long time, and then, when she pulled back, looked at him with the specific face of a parent who has processed the version of events where the outcome was different and cannot fully put that version away. On his way out, Renner stopped at the nursing station on the ER floor and asked for Evelyn. She came out from the corridor where she'd been reviewing a patient chart. He looked better than he had, still moving carefully, still carrying the residual caution of a body that had recently been reminded of its own structural limits, but present in a way he hadn't been on the 14th. I heard about the job, he said. Word travels, she said. I wanted to say... He stopped. He had the quality of someone who had rehearsed something and found, in the moment, that it didn't fit right. I'm not good at this kind of thing. You don't have to say anything, she said. I know, I want to. He looked at her directly. You got arrested and then you came here and you saved my life. I don't know what to do with that, but I wanted you to know that I know it. She looked at him. He was 22 years old and he would carry the 14th of October for the rest of his life the way people carry the days that could have gone differently and didn't. She would too. They would both carry it, but they would carry it as people who were present for what came next. Take care of yourself, she said, and let the physio team finish the work. Don't go back to full duty before they clear you. My CO is going to push for faster. Show him the discharge paperwork, she said, and if he pushes again, give him my number. Renner almost smiled, the full version of it this time, easier than the one on the 14th. Yes, ma'am. He left with his mother. Evelyn watched them through the lobby windows until they were gone, and then she went back to the corridor and the chart and the work that needed doing. Kobe, the day shift RN who had handed Evelyn the chart on the morning of the 14th without making eye contact, found her in the supply room 3 weeks later. The actual supply room, the one off the trauma bay, which Evelyn had reorganized entirely with color-coded sections and a laminated quick reference guide on the inside of the door that the residents had already started calling the cheat sheet. I wanted to say something, Kobe said. About that morning. Evelyn was counting IV supplies. She didn't stop. Okay. I stood there, Kobe said, in the parking lot, when Drake arrested you. I stood there and I didn't say anything and I gave you the chart later like it was a regular day and She stopped. I've been thinking about it. What did you come up with? That I was scared, Kobe said. Not of Drake specifically, just of, I didn't know what was happening and I didn't know what saying something would do and so I didn't. Evelyn finished the count. She wrote the number on the inventory sheet. She looked at Kobe, who was in her early 40s and had been a nurse for 15 years and was a good one, the kind who caught things and didn't make a fuss about catching them. Fear is real, Evelyn said. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. It still feels like an excuse. It might be both, Evelyn said. Real and an excuse at the same time. Most of the things we do are both. Kobe looked at her. Does it bother you? That none of us? Yes, Evelyn said, straightforwardly, without heat. It did bother me. Standing there with my hands locked behind me while people I'd worked next to for 3 years watched and didn't move, yes, that bothered me. Kobe absorbed that. And I'm also still here, Evelyn said, and so are you. And the question now is what we do with the time we have in the same building. She put the inventory sheet on the clipboard and handed Kobe the marker to sign off on the count she'd witnessed. Kobe took the marker. She signed. She handed it back. Thank you, she said, for being straight about it. It's the only way I know how to be, Evelyn said. The formal public record correction was published by the Army Medical Command in the 4th week of November. It appeared in the official registry and was additionally distributed to the relevant medical institutions, law enforcement agencies, and news organizations that had covered the initial arrest. It stated, in the precise and bureaucratic language of official records, that the charges against Lieutenant Evelyn Brooks, filed on the 14th of October, had been determined to be entirely without factual basis, having originated in a coordinated effort to remove her from duty for fraudulent purposes, and that her record was clear of all associated notations. It was 3 paragraphs. It was not dramatic language. It didn't need to be. The thing about truth, when it finally arrives in writing after the alternative has been in circulation, is that it doesn't require embellishment. It just requires being said clearly and being said publicly, so that the people who heard the wrong version can read the right one. Local news ran the story. It spread in the contained but real way that regional stories spread when they have enough components: a nurse, an arrest, military vehicles, a federal conspiracy, a general salute in a hospital corridor. Someone national picked it up. Evelyn did not speak to any of them. She had Fail's assistant send a statement. The record had been corrected. The investigation had produced the right outcomes. She was focused on her work at Silver Ridge. The calls came anyway. She let them go to voicemail and returned to the reorganized supply room and the new training schedule she was building, and the 3 residents who had started showing up 15 minutes early to trauma bay shifts because something had shifted in the culture of the floor and people were paying attention in a different way. She didn't know if she had caused that. She suspected it was more diffuse than that. The sum of a day that had been witnessed by a lot of people, settling into the institutional fabric of the place in the way significant events settle, not announced, just present. She took it for what it was. On a Thursday in December, exactly 8 weeks after the 14th of October, Evelyn drove to work in the same Subaru with the same cracked passenger side mirror she'd been meaning to replace, parked in the employee lot in a different spot than usual because someone had taken hers, and walked into Silver Ridge Medical Center through the main entrance. She was in her scrubs. Her new badge, the one with the correct title on it, was clipped to her chest. Her coffee was hot this time because she'd left the apartment with enough time to stop at the place on Miller Street that made it right. The morning was ordinary, a slip and fall in triage, 2 chest pains, one of which turned out to be musculoskeletal and one of which was more serious and required a consult with cardiology, a pediatric case that resolved better than it initially presented. The standard, grinding, necessary work of an emergency department on a Thursday in December in a mid-sized Montana city. She moved through it the way she moved through things, steadily, without announcement, doing the next thing that needed doing. At 10 in the morning, Dr. Chiao stopped her in the corridor. "Daniel's called," Chiao said. "The corporal from Bay 5. He got cleared for full duty." "Good," Evelyn said. "He asked me to tell you. Said he figured you'd want to know." She did want to know. She put it in the part of her that kept track of outcomes, the running count that had no official form, but that she maintained anyway, because the work only makes sense if you know what it produces. She went back to the floor. She was charting at the nurse's station at noon when Renata stopped beside her with a patient update and then lingered, which was unlike Renata, who was efficient and not prone to lingering. "What?" Evelyn said without looking up. "Nothing," Renata said. "Just, it's good that you're still here." Evelyn looked up from the chart. Renata was already walking away, back toward the triage area, back into the machinery of the morning. Evelyn watched her go. She looked around the nurse's station, at the board with its patient names and status codes, at the corridor with its institutional lighting and its scuff-marked baseboards, at the ordinary, unglamorous infrastructure of a place where people came on their worst days and needed someone to know what to do. She knew what to do. She had always known what to do. The only thing that had ever been in question was whether the place she was doing it would let her, and that question had been answered in the most costly and clarifying way possible. And she was still standing in the same building 8 weeks later with a better badge and a reorganized supply room and 3 residents who showed up early, and the work was the same work it had always been. She turned back to the chart. There is a particular kind of person who exists in the space between what they've survived and what they do with it. Not the person who performs survival, not the version that gets made into a speech or a ceremony or a salute in a hospital corridor, though those things were real and she would carry them. The version that shows up on a Thursday morning in December and does the next thing. The version that doesn't wait for the right conditions or the right recognition or the right moment to begin, because the work doesn't wait and the patients don't wait, and the version of yourself that waits for permission is the version that never quite arrives. She had been underestimated by a man with a badge in a parking lot, and no particular curiosity about who he was actually looking at. She had been maneuvered by a woman with a title and a grudge, and a willingness to let soldiers die for a board seat. She had been watched and not intervened for by people she had worked beside for 3 years. People who were not bad, but who were afraid, which is a different thing, but produces similar results when the moment demands more than fear allows. And she was still here. Not because the system had protected her, not because the right people had shown up in time. The right people had almost not shown up at all. 3 years without anyone knowing her record, and on the one morning when it mattered most, the margin between soldiers surviving and not surviving had been the 11 minutes it took to drive from the station to the hospital after Marsh intervened. 11 minutes. That was the margin. That was how much room there had been between the version of October 14th, where everything went Alcott's way, and the version that actually happened. The point was not that it had worked out. The point was that it had almost not worked out, and the thing that had closed the gap was not a system or a procedure or an institution. It was a woman who had kept doing her job with everything she had for 3 years, in a place where nobody knew what she was, and who had walked into a trauma bay in the clothes she'd been arrested in and done the work anyway. You do not need to be seen to be what you are, but eventually, one way or another, what you are makes itself visible. The question is whether you've kept it intact for the moment when it matters. Evelyn Brooks had. She finished the chart. She clipped her pen back to her pocket. She picked up her coffee, which was finally the right temperature,